calling on John Sabala to teach us about military culture, because he's awesome. He teaches my students military culture in our boot camp that we have before clinic, because a lot of people don't know that you can't call a soldier a sailor, and you can't call an airman a Marine. And so we do military culture in boot camp, and it's really fun, and I appreciate John's involvement in that. I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker. I hope everybody had a moment to read her 2 articles, which are found on her bio page on our website. Dr. Susan Okie is a Harvard-trained physician. She became a journalist with the Washington Post. She served under Bob Woodward, worked with Bob Woodward at the Washington Post. In 2005, she wrote about 2 soldiers who were at Walter Reed, who had suffered traumatic brain injury, and she followed him again in 2006, and her articles were published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They're very good, and she's here today to share with us a follow-up on those 2 articles. So I hope you read the articles. If you haven't, read them later. But without further ado, as Professor Neiman says, here is Dr. Susan Okie. Thank you. But it's coming. And I want to give a big shout out to our IT department, really, because we are live streaming, and they're awesome, and they really make the law school go round and round. So thank you, Scott. Is this the slide you want to start with? Okay.
Can't hear.
If the, well, this is fine, I'll just do this. So it's great pleasure to be here today. I really want to thank Angela Drake and Amy King and all the students and staff and others who put this symposium together. I think it was a brilliant idea to put traumatic brain injuries in the military and in sports together, and I've learned a lot. And congratulations also, and thank you to the veterans and families who are here today. So you should know, maybe you know from watching the slides that have been showing in between and before the presentation, that traumatic brain injury is a major national health problem in the United States, not only in athletes, not only in the military. We have more than 2 million emergency department visits every year for traumatic brain injury, 280,000 hospitalizations a year, and 50,000 deaths. So we've been focusing today on traumatic brain injury in military and athletes, but this kind of injury can and does happen to anyone of any age. It affects both sexes, all age groups from infants and toddlers to the elderly. Falls, much to your surprise maybe from what we've been talking about, are the leading cause by far. They account for 40% of such brain injuries. And second, of course, is suffering a blow to the head or striking your head against an object. And then following that is motor vehicle accidents and assaults. Men are nearly 3 times as likely to die of a TBI as women, because men tend to do more contact sports, take more risks, drive more motorcycles, etc. And people who are 65 and older have the highest death rates from traumatic brain injuries. So I'm not an expert on traumatic brain injury. I'm not a neurologist or a neurosurgeon or any of those specialties that we heard mentioned earlier. Instead, I'm a doctor trained in family medicine who spent most of my career as a medical reporter and science editor. My interest in traumatic brain injury started 10 years ago. 10 years ago, in early 2005, when my editors at the New England Journal of Medicine asked me to write about the rising numbers of serious brain injuries in soldiers wounded in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. I got in touch with doctors and psychologists studying and treating these injuries at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And at that hospital, I was introduced to two Army sergeants, David Emme and Jason Pepper, who were patients there. Everything that I've learned about traumatic brain injury is filtered through the stories of these two remarkable men. In separate incidents in Iraq, Sergeants David Emme and Jason Pepper were exposed at close range to the explosion of an IED, an improvised explosive device. They suffered multiple wounds, but because of Kevlar body armor, they weren't killed as were US soldiers in Vietnam and earlier wars who were caught in explosions of similar force. When I met Emme and Pepper, they were going through intensive rehabilitation, counseling, physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. They were being tested and treated for what the brain injuries had done to their senses, thinking, memories, speech, sleep, dreams, and emotions. And both of them also had post-traumatic stress disorder. Sergeant Emme, who you see here, who at 32 had been in the military for a decade, woke up from a 10-day coma unable to speak. The blast had damaged a large portion of the left side of his brain. Doctors had been forced to remove a big chunk of his skull. Here's a model. Just to prevent additional damage to his swollen brain from pressing against the bone. And you can see the size, if that were, a life-size skull, you can see how big a piece they took out and later had to reconstruct months later. So so David described to me, I called for the nurse. I kept just trying to say something, but I couldn't really say anything. He told me this when I met him a few months after the injury. Basically, I had to learn what things were again. Or rather, he knew what things were, but he didn't know what they were called. For instance, telling friends about a visit he had made to the Pentagon during his hospitalization, he'd say, yeah, I went to that place that had the big bang when they flew the planes into it. Sergeant Pepper, a 28-year-old combat engineer who loved firefighting, video games, and softball, was adjusting not only to having an injured brain, but to having lost both eyes in the explosion. While also recovering from a shattered right forearm and the loss of his left index finger, enduring terrible nightmares and migraines and dealing with troubles with his memory, thinking, moods, and sleep, he was trying to learn to read Braille and how to use a computer and do all the tasks of daily life as a blind man. When I first met him, his eyelids were permanently closed. Later, he was provided with prosthetic eyes, which he's wearing in this photo. I interviewed the two soldiers at length at the hospital, and I talked with those treating them and with researchers who were learning new lessons about brain injuries from survivors like these. During the years of peak involvement of US troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, blasts from IEDs or mines were by far the most common cause of injury, and 59% of blast-exposed patients at Walter Reed were found to have a traumatic brain injury, which we also call a TBI. New kinds of brain imaging demonstrated in animal studies that a blast wave can damage brain tissue even if there's no head wound. Those discoveries have led, and they're still leading, to the overdue recognition of cases of brain injury in Vietnam veterans and in others, both military and civilians who've been exposed to the force of explosions. Here is a painting of an IED exploding in a town in Iraq or Afghanistan, done more recently by a soldier with a TBI who was undergoing an intensive 4-week rehabilitation program at the recently expanded Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, which is now located in Bethesda, Maryland. So as you've heard, my article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the first article, in May of 2005, and for those who haven't read them, I'm sort of glad if you haven't, because I'm recapitulating some of the story that you will have read in the article. So not long after that, Sergeants Emme and Pepper were discharged from the Army and returned to civilian life. Both of them were grief-stricken at leaving the military. They were dedicated soldiers who told me repeatedly that they would not have done anything differently and they would re-enlist if they could. Their wounds had separated them from their closest friends, their sense of mission, and their chosen occupation. When Emme first learned that he would be discharged, he told me, I was so depressed I wouldn't even get out of bed. On the basis of his brain injury, he was considered 100% disabled by the VA, and Pepper was categorized as R1, which he explained was the VA's code for maximally disabled. That was before they came up with R2. Or as he put it with his characteristic black humor, the highest you can go without being classified as a vegetable. I should note that Pepper's quick mind and his dark, deadpan jokes caught the attention of the cartoonist Gary Trudeau, who spent time with injured soldiers at Walter Reed for a sequence of Doonesbury strips. He drew a character named Sergeant Pepper into the strips, and he may have partially based another character named Toggle on David Emme. In the fall of 2006, I re-interviewed Pepper and Emme at their new homes for a follow-up article on their recovery and their new lives. Pepper had completed a 3-month inpatient rehabilitation program for blind veterans at the Hines Veterans Affairs Hospital in Illinois, focusing on helping him become more independent. He was assigned to travel alone by public transportation into downtown Chicago and back, using a cane and a personal GPS device. But despite having acquired those urban navigation skills, as a civilian he chose to live in the country, an hour outside of Nashville, beyond the reach of public transportation, because his brain injury and PTSD had left him with disabling headaches and episodic anxiety. He told me, "You don't have the hustle and bustle of all the traffic. You don't have the honking of horns, the sirens. You hear gunshots, but it's target practice or hunting. The crickets get kind of annoying." Jason's lifelong love of technology had made it fairly easy for him to learn to operate his computer and other electronic devices by voice, but he quickly lost patience with trying to read Braille or cook by touch. When I visited, his wife, Heather, was in her final month of pregnancy with their second child, and she was driving Jason to and from college 2 days a week. He hoped to get a bachelor's degree and then a job. But he hadn't seen a doctor or enrolled into the VA health system in the year that had passed since he'd left Walter Reed. He was taking escalating doses of a pain medication for migraines, was smoking heavily, drinking quite a bit of beer, and had gained 50 pounds. Bitter that he could no longer run on a road or a treadmill because of the risk of falling, he complained, "I'm fat, lethargic, and have no energy." This is a slide of Jason with his newborn daughter, who was born soon after my visit. Meanwhile, David Emme had spent the intervening year restoring lost connections, learning to speak again, trying to overcome headaches and mood swings, piecing together the story of his injury, getting back in touch with army buddies and relatives, and letting friends know he was alive. Single and with no home to go to after his military discharge, he tracked down his father, whom he hadn't spoken with since his parents' divorce 2 decades earlier. When he learned that his dad was disabled after a heart attack and stroke, he moved to his father's trailer home north of Allentown, Pennsylvania, and became his caretaker, cleaning, shopping, driving him to medical appointments. Here's David and his dad. He contacted fellow soldiers from his Army Stryker Brigade, many of whom thought that he had died of his wounds. "It was hard for them, but it was harder for me," he said of his wounding and his medical evacuation from Iraq. "They lost 1. I lost 82. Attending a reunion ball in 2006 with members of his brigade was one of the greatest moments of my life, he told me. Like Pepper, Emme hadn't seen a doctor since his discharge, nor had he enrolled in the VA health system. He was still experiencing annoying muscle twitching, sleep apnea, and frightening hallucinations that came on when he tried to go to sleep. To me, his speech seemed fluent and clear, but he complained that he sometimes got lost during conversations. He planned to enroll part-time in a business program at a nearby college. He had taken himself off of all prescription medicines. Basically, it got to a point where I could figure out my own stuff, he told me. My visits with Pepper and Emme for this second article left me stunned at how easy it can be for veterans to fall off the radar screen once they leave the military. By late 2006, more than 22,000 US soldiers had been wounded in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations during the global war on terrorism. The Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs were planning for what they termed a seamless transition for thousands of brain-injured veterans from military medicine to the VA or civilian health care. But based on what I had learned from these two men, there seemed to be no guarantee that there would even be a healthcare transition, much less a seamless one. Like many soldiers who are discharged from the military, they hadn't signed up with a doctor or sought medical care, and to my surprise, it appeared that nobody was tracking them. I realized what neurologist Deborah Warden had told me, or I recalled what neurologist Deborah Warden had told me at Walter Reed when I visited the first time. Keep in mind, she said, these patients, because of the nature of their brain injuries, can be the ones at highest risk of falling through the cracks. Here is another piece of art by a soldier with TBI who was undergoing rehabilitation at Walter Reed. You can see a ghost-like figure here with the legend, "Out of the shadows," and then the same figure outdoors under the sky. The title at the top reads, "Repairs." Years went by. I didn't hear from David Emme, but I'd get Christmas cards from Heather Pepper, and once an excited email message from Jason. He'd read about an experimental car that could drive itself. It was demonstrated at the Daytona Speedway, veering around obstacles with a blindfolded person at the wheel. "I need one of these," he wrote. "I want to drive my kids to school." Then a few months ago, a law student here at the University of Missouri wrote me to invite me to speak at this symposium. Why me, I wondered. It turned out someone had seen one of my articles about the two sergeants. I realized that it might be a chance to find them again, hear what had happened in the 9 years since I'd last seen them. It's the kind of opportunity that we rarely get as journalists. We peer into people's lives at a significant moment, like when they've survived a disaster or won the Nobel Prize. But we don't usually find out how their lives go after that moment of public attention. I did find them again, thanks to Facebook. David Emme had a harrowing story to tell. His father died 7 months after David was reunited with him. David stayed on alone in the Northeast Pennsylvania trailer home they shared, taking classes at nearby Muhlenberg College towards a bachelor's degree in business. Hoping to marry one day, he began corresponding with a young woman in the Philippines and even visited her twice for several weeks at a time. But then, in 2009, something happened. He'd been seeing a doctor and was taking a medicine to help him quit smoking. He was using other medications to help him sleep. The best way I can describe it was I had a nervous breakdown, he said. He began having terrifying dreams about Iraq, about dying. Sometimes I felt like I was falling, he recalled. In my dream, I was screaming as loud as I could, and I couldn't even wake myself up. He says that he completely withdrew from college, friends, his girlfriend, his online connections, his everyday life. I just kind of shut everybody out, he said. I didn't take phone calls. I didn't want to deal with anybody. I wanted it to stop. After 5 years in the Marines and 5 in the Army, he blamed himself for getting stressed out by the responsibilities he'd taken on, for not being able to do all the things he thought he should. You always pride yourself on integrity, on being able to put yourself out there, he said. I guess it was depression, but more overwhelming guilt. He took to swallowing 50 Benadryl pills at a time to knock himself out for 12 or 13 hours of dreamless sleep. If I go to sleep, I don't feel guilty, he told me. Emme recalls getting messages of concern from staff members at the Veterans Affairs Health System during this time, but he didn't answer them. At last, his best friend Steve Smith in California, whom he'd known since 1990, sent a police officer to David's home to check on him. When the policeman reported back, Steve, whose marriage had recently ended, moved across country to take care of David, eventually completing a VA training program to become his friend's certified caretaker. The two believed they saved each other's lives. He did so much for me, Emme says. I'm finally getting stronger every day, trying to replace bad habits with good habits. I finally quit smoking. He's back in school and seeing a VA psychiatrist for his sleep disorder and nightmares. About the breakdown, he says, it really has helped me to pause and figure out what I can and can't handle. Maybe that was the Lord's way of trying to slow me down. Here's a recent picture of David from his Facebook page. 2 years ago, Jason Pepper moved with his growing family to suburban San Antonio, a move triggered by a new rule issued by TRICARE, his health insurer, that he had to live within a certain distance of a military treatment facility or VA medical center. With 3 children now, his wife Heather is a full-time parent and her husband's certified caretaker. Jason told me he often wishes that the light switches and the appliances in the new house had the kind of technology that talks back to the user so that he could help out more. Before I could possibly cook because there were knobs on the stove, he said. Now everything is touchscreen and you have to see to use the equipment. He's become an expert on adaptive technology for the blind. 3 years ago, he partnered with a staffer at Hines Veterans Affairs Hospital, where he previously attended the rehab program, to start an annual week-long workshop for visually impaired veterans to learn about advances in adaptive technology tools. To prepare, he tests new devices and helps teach the course. Last June, he taught a session on the Apple Watch. He's tried to find work testing products or software for adaptability for people who are visually impaired. But he said he's been hampered by not having a bachelor's degree or certain IT certifications. A former New Jersey State firefighter and paramedic, he has about a year of academic work left to finish a bachelor's program in fire science and emergency management. He dreams of working in disaster planning for the Federal Emergency Management Agency or for a private company. His approach to life after a brain injury has been to stay involved with the things he's always loved. You have to find something that clicks with the individual, he told me. Technology works for me. Firefighting works. The way I train or exercise my mind is music, trying to memorize songs. For his PTSD and the related problems that can often follow a TBI, mood swings, depression, insomnia, Jason has sometimes seen mental health professionals at military and VA centers, but as he tells it, he's had bad luck in the counselors he drew. His Army psychiatrist at Walter Reed was Dr. Nidal Hassan, who later became the Fort Hood shooter. The counselor treating him in Tennessee came from the very town in Afghanistan where the IED had exploded in his face, and he said she asked him how he felt about shooting at her people. For now, he's handling those symptoms on his own. I do have anger issues. I've noticed that, he said. I've been working on it to try to remove myself from situations, doing breathing techniques. I go through periods when I can't sleep and periods when I just want to sleep. Nightmares come and go. It's really hard to find what triggers it. With Heather's help, he weaned himself off all prescription medicines, except what he needs to treat his migraines. They were pumping me full of so much, I'd walk around like a zombie, he recalled. During the withdrawal from the medicines, there was like a 4 to 6 month period when it was really tough. Then it started to smooth itself out. He gave up drinking too, although he still smokes. Jason relies on the VA health system for his medical care and for important equipment like the prosthetic eyes. He's experienced long appointment delays, red tape, and high staff turnover, persistent issues in the VA system that have been widely reported around the country. He's had to change doctors frequently and says his latest one has such a strong accent that he can barely understand her. She, on the other hand, apparently had not perused his medical record before meeting him. The lady had no clue that I was blind, he recalled. Heather Pepper, who received a stipend as Jason's caregiver under the VA's Family Caregiver Program, became politically active when a local staffer threatened to disqualify some veterans from that program, saying they weren't sufficiently disabled. She fought that decision in Jason's case, contacting a member of Congress and others to help advocate for her family. The caregiver movement that Heather helped start in the San Antonio area has since spread to other communities. The high suicide rate among veterans, an average of 22 suicides a day, has become Jason Pepper's personal issue. Last October, a soldier he befriended while both were being treated at Walter Reed committed suicide. A week and a half later, Jason's mother died. 2 months after that, another longtime friend from the military went to sleep and never woke up. It was really rough, he recalled. Mentally, I was stable, but it was at the point where I was thinking, let me grab a bottle and let me find whatever pills. Since then, on the 22nd of every month, Pepper makes it a point to call friends from his time in the armed forces to check in on how they're doing. He says the practice is spreading among veterans around the country. If I call 5, and those 5 call 5, and those 5 call 5, it's the whole pyramid effect, he said. These are masks created by veterans with TBI as part of the same 4-week intensive outpatient rehabilitation program. What do I take away from these men's stories, from David, Emme, and Jason Pepper and their 10-year journey with traumatic brain injury? The first thing I've learned is that surgical and medical treatment put them back together in the short run, but what has saved their lives in the long run has been personal relationships. Government agencies and overbooked health systems aren't going to make house calls when a veteran misses a medical appointment or fails to answer telephone messages. It was the strength of a close friendship that brought David Emme's buddy Steve to his door at the critical moment and may have prevented him from accidentally dying of an overdose. It was the strength of Jason Pepper's marriage and his devotion to his family, I believe, that got him through periods of overwhelming grief for what he'd lost. Clearly for both men, their personal courage, their pride in having served in the military, and their loyalty to their fellow soldiers have been additional sources of strength. I've also learned that recovery from a serious brain injury isn't like a nonstop plane flight from Washington to Los Angeles, where you land and say, "I've arrived." Maybe it's more like the flight of a monarch butterfly. Flutter up, flutter down, make some headway towards the south, get blown back a bit by the wind, rest, sip some nectar, take off again. By visiting with these soldiers at 3 different points in time, I've seen plenty of evidence of healing, not just in how they sound and what they're able to do, but how they experience feelings and memories, how they see themselves in the world. Yet I recognize that for each man, I'm looking at only 3 snapshots in time. When I asked Jason Pepper what lasting effects he notices from his TBI, he couldn't say. I know I have some memory issues. I've been through speech therapy. I used to slur a lot more. I don't even know what the residual effects are. Investigating these residual effects in the brain and how they change over time is the goal of a large 15-year study that was launched 3 or 4 years ago by the Defense and Veterans Brain Injury Center, a research institute at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, again in Bethesda. Leading it is the center's deputy director, neuropsychologist Louis M. French, who I met for the first time when I met the 2 veterans 10 years ago. Researchers want to understand the natural history of traumatic brain injury, its impact on those injured and their families, whether there are factors that can predict recovery or failure to improve, whether certain treatments, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or directed computer-based cognitive exercises, can help injured nerve tracts to reconnect and promote healing. They even plan to study whether a brain injury produces any immediate change in the blood, perhaps a biochemical marker that might become the basis of a blood test to rapidly diagnose a concussion in someone injured in combat, a car crash, a football game, or a fall. As of last month, researchers had recruited 631 subjects for the comprehensive arm of the study. Each veteran with TBI undergoes 2 days of tests, neuroimaging of the brain structure, function, and electrical activity, assessments of thinking, personality, emotional responses. Blood is drawn for genetic and protein analysis, and they undergo comprehensive physical and sensory exams. Then periodically they'll be brought back and the entire process repeated. Data from those assessments will be compared to similar information obtained from soldiers who were deployed to a combat zone but not wounded, and to a group who were wounded but didn't have a brain injury. Meanwhile, a separate study has so far enrolled 345 caregivers of brain-injured veterans and will examine how the role impacts the caregivers' physical and mental health and their own use of the medical system. Dr. French told me his work with veterans over the past decade has taught him there's no easy way to predict how an individual will heal. I had this kind of fantasy there would be certain things we could see in people, initial symptoms or characteristics that would be very good predictors of how a person was going to be at a year out, at 10 years out, he said. But there's huge variability in the recovery process. We can't find any unifying characteristics that predict that at this point. He explained that in trying to understand how Pepper and Emme have responded to their injuries, it's impossible to separate the physical effects on the brain itself from the emotional responses that the brain generates, what he calls the mind. He told me they both had bad brain injuries. The structures in the brain that support emotionality was very likely affected. That's the brain's response to what happened. But there's also the mind's response. And they're sad over their circumstances. When you have a devastating injury, sometimes you can easily fall into pessimism. Am I ever going to be okay? What's my future? So situations and environmental things can contribute. How well someone recovers may also depend on whether he's been injured in other parts of the body, whether he's lost hearing or vision, as in Pepper's case, and whether he's also suffering from pain, depression, and PTSD. Based on studies so far in the military, French says the brain itself seems to respond to injury from a blast in very much the same way as it would to an injury caused by any other mechanism, a motor vehicle accident, say, or a head-on collision with a defensive lineman. In 3 major studies that used neuropsychological testing on TBI patients, no significant differences were found, but blast injuries are more often associated with damage to sensory organs and other parts of the body. They seem also to be more emotionally horrific. People feel a greater sense of personal threat. Hence, we see greater rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, French said. The baseline frequency of PTSD in our adult population in the United States is about 9%, he told me, probably reflecting our society's high rates of exposure to violence, including sexual assault, domestic violence, the witnessing of child abuse and other violent acts, crime victimization, and serious motor vehicle accidents. Interestingly, 44% of soldiers who suffered a mild TBI while deployed in Iraq screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder, a much higher proportion than the 16% frequency of PTSD that was found in those who had only bodily injuries. Mild traumatic brain injuries, garden variety concussions, actually therefore seem to carry a higher risk of PTSD than more serious ones, according to both military and civilian studies. If you have a severe brain injury and you're in a coma for 10 days, it's highly likely you don't remember anything about getting hurt, French told me. Even so, David Emme, who did have a severe brain injury and was in a coma for 10 days, has typical symptoms of PTSD. So it's clear we can't predict how someone will respond to a traumatic brain injury or what the recovery will look like. What we've learned so far from soldiers with combat-related brain injuries and what we're likely to learn from these ongoing studies in military and civilian populations offers the potential for improved diagnosis of concussion and more precise ways to evaluate, treat, and rehabilitate head injuries. Our society's heightened awareness of the long-term effects of brain injury will, I trust, lead to more effective prevention and protection on the sports field and in a variety of other settings. I hope the stories of Jason Pepper and David Emme make you marvel at the complexity and resilience of the brain and mind, which I consider more or less 2 words for the same thing, that miraculous organ that's been called the most complex object in the universe, the organ that makes each of us who we are. I want to leave you with one last story about these 2 men that has stayed with me for weeks, ever since I spoke with them. When David Emme came out of his nervous breakdown, he began seeing a VA psychiatrist who prescribed a medicine that seemed to vanquish his nightmares and turned his dreams sweet. My dreams were a lot more vivid, he told me, but they were really positive. Jason Pepper, too, can go for a couple months now at a stretch without having nightmares, and he looks forward to dreaming. I like sleeping because that's the only way I can see. It seems like I don't dream like a normal person. I'm not dreaming in the first-person perspective. I'm dreaming in the third-person perspective. I'm dreaming seeing myself. It's really weird, and I don't understand it. A dream could be set now or in the past. It goes both ways. I'm dreaming seeing myself as blind or as seeing the way I was before. It seems to me that if we're looking for evidence that a gravely wounded brain can heal, there's a powerful piece of it. Imagine the relief after weeks or months of nightmares of no longer having to dread going to sleep. Imagine looking forward to seeing the world again in a dream, the way you once saw it in daylight. It gives me hope, not only for David and Jason, but for thousands of others, whose brains have been wounded in combat, in accidents, in games, in fights, in beatings, or in other acts of violence. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. I forgot to tell you Dr. Okie is a poet, and I think that came through beautifully in both your writing and the delivery of it. Thank you very much. Any questions of Dr. Okie before we end our symposium? She's in change glasses? No? Thank you all so much for coming to Mizzou Law today and for wanting to learn about these issues. And we hope for those who are staying for the attorney CLE that you'll learn and help veterans. And again, thank you, safe travels. Round of applause for our panelists one more time. Thank you.